This is the MIT Mobility Forum and organized by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, it's really my great pleasure to have Professor Nick Blum from Stanford to talk to us about his research on the future of working from home. Right. Before I formally introduce Nick, I do want to say a few words about the logistics, etc. In this forum, there are two rules or expectations. One, as much as you can, video on, audio off. Right. We like to see smiley faces. Right. And we're talking about the interaction, the mode of interaction. Seeing people's smiley faces makes the presenter much more comfortable and engaged. Right. So that's one. Secondly, given you already choose to spend 1 hour here, please everybody contribute one idea in the form of a comment or a question. You can type it all along the way into the chat. Right. We'll compile this information and knowledge and forward back to the speaker. Often speaker really appreciate those type of ideas there. Right. Okay, I'd like to do two warm-up exercises. So I'm putting a poll here, which is asking you, where are you working today? So I'm launching the poll right now. So I'm working at home. I'm working at my regular office or school or working site. I'm working at a third place, meaning a cafe or library or community center, your friend's house, your associate's house. Basically not home, not office, anything in between, anything anywhere else. And then I don't work. I'll give 5 more seconds.
You know what? I think this is dominated by it being Friday.
That's true. That's true. So it's not. That's as a second question, try to address a little bit on that, right? So I'll pause the poll and share the result. Okay. Yeah, indeed. 65% are working at home today in this audience, 30% in the office, 3% in the third place, and 2% do not work. Right. Thanks. Second question is about your commuting. Right. On the average sense, how frequently do you physically commute to work or school? 5 days a week, 4, 3, 2, 1, fully remote? I do not work.
That's a little biased by us retired guys, right?
I'll give 5 more seconds. Okay, 220 people entered the poll. So here's the result. Quite a distribution here. 20%, 11, 19, 18, 11, 20. Good, yeah. So Nick, hopefully we give some context for you from the audience. So last question is in the chat, I invite everybody to type in your organization, your city, and your local time. So I will say MIT, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 12 no. Yeah, Nick, you can see that we really have a global audience. Many people coming at very like 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. all sort of different time zone who joining this here. Yeah, but thanks everybody. Yeah.
To comment on the work from home numbers, it looks very much like you'd expect from a very educated audience. It's like a mix between fully in person, fully remote, and hybrid. It's you'll see it. That's very consistent with people that have basically at least a BA and mostly a PhD. That would be a good prediction.
Very interesting. Yeah, thanks, Nick. So Professor Nick Blum is the definite scholar who's examining the remote working and its implications on cities, firms, and employees. Right. Remote working has been practiced for a long time, enabled by information communication technology, more with augmented reality, virtual reality, etc. But COVID offered a mandatory, coordinated, and large-scale social experiment. Right. I think no better person than Professor Nick Blum to share with us his research on that. And Nick is the William Abel Professor of Economics at Stanford University. His research focused on the work from home, management practice, and uncertainty. He previously worked at the UK Treasury at McKinsey and Company. He's a fellow of American Academy of Art and Science and a recipient of the Guggenheim and the Sloan Fellowship. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Professor Nick Blanc. Nick, please.
Gerard, thanks very much. I'm going to go to share screen. Let's hopefully my screen kind of seems to share everything, so it may double share chat, but let's see, high floating meeting controls. I'll get rid of this. Go to full screen. So I'm going to talk about the future of work from home. I'll talk for like 20 minutes, and then, as you say, we'll go to this Q&A and then discussion. So oddly enough, I've been working on this for almost 20 years. No one was that hugely interested in work for, it was a topic, and certainly I was interested in, but it was hard to get too many people engaged until March 2020, in which case everything just, went crazy. Since that time, in fact, with Jinhua and the MIT lab, we've been running surveys with folks. I'll show you a lot of data. We've been running a lot of surveys across North America and more globally. And the other thing I've been doing is talking to hundreds of organizations, a lot of firms, but a lot of other things like national labs, universities, my local city council, schools. Yesterday morning, I spoke to a global charity actually based out of Ireland, so a big mix. So I'll talk about three things: current data on working from home, where we are now, where we look like we're heading. Quickly, some thoughts on management. This is slightly more of an exec ed thing, but it's kind of interesting, and I think it relates to universities. Like, I've been working a lot with Stanford. MIT will be the same. Stanford, I think, has 3,000 faculty and 15,000 staff. And for the staff, it's a big issue, and for university administration and for anyone that's working out there. And then finally, some of the economic impacts. So what do we know about work from home? So work from home pre-COVID was about 5% of full paid days. There's a lot of different ways to measure work from home. My preferred measure, and I think relevant to this group because it impacts commuting and office space, is full paid days at home. Since a lot of people work in the mornings and evenings, etc. Before the pandemic, it was about 5%. We have data actually going all the way back to the 60s. It was about 0.5% in 65. So it's been rising at a gradual rate. Pandemic happens, it surges to 60%, and then it's been dropping off, and looks like now it's kind of flattening out at about 30%. It may be with a recession or drop down to about 25%, but I don't think it's going to go below there. So to put this in perspective, the 6-fold increase from pre to post pandemic is equivalent to about 50 years of pre-pandemic growth. So it has been an enormous change, and it looks like we are permanently at a much higher level of work from home. Whoops. So where does this 30% come from? So here's again data for the US. There are 3 groups of people in the US, 3 groups in the labor force. So there are folks that are fully on site. That's 55%. They're mostly frontline employees. Think of, Chipotle, McDonald's, security, teaching, to be honest, schools, hospitals. A lot of folks, they're typically lower paid, although definitely not entirely. I mean, surgeons are in this group, as are high frequency traders. There's another group, which probably includes pretty much everyone listening: professionals, managers, most of our students, mostly grads, typically higher paid, and they're hybrid. So 2-3-3-2, kind of very common schemes. And then finally, there's a group, about 15% of the fully remote. So people kind of think these are all like Airbnb and Yelp coders, but the large majority of this group are things like IT support, payroll, HR. They're often contractors. So in Stanford, we'd have a bunch of these, but many of these, IT support and stuff are actually no longer formally employees of the university. So if you add this up, these folks, hybrid employees, typically are in the office half the time. That gives you 15% of working days from them. And there's another 15% from these. This is where you get to about 30% of full paid days work from home. And I've shown you data for the US. This is another data set. It's from Google Workplace Mobility. It's tracking billions of cell phones. I'm not going to go into how exactly they do it, but they have an estimate of basically the change in commuting. And this is almost perfectly the inverse of work from home, or, as Jinhua said, work from anywhere. Mostly it's home, but not entirely, and I'm happy to discuss that later. So you can see the US, Canada, very similar. This drop is 25% the US. It almost perfectly matches the 25% increase I talked about from 5 to 30. Northern Europe looks pretty similar. Australia, developed Asia looks lower, but it's still an increase versus pre-pandemic. So much of Northern Europe, US, Canada looks very similar. And you should think of this when you think about what's going on. So why is hybrid become so dominant? Why for all of us? Pretty much every company I've talked to, I mean, honestly, I don't know, at this point, maybe 500, possibly 1,000 different organizations. I talked to probably 2 a day since the pandemic began. And almost all of them are adopted hybrid for people like us, grads, post-grads, professionals. So there are 4 reasons. I'll just go through these quickly. Hybrid, which is, to be clear, a typical hybrid plan is something like this. You come into the office Tuesday, Thursday, you work from home Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So I mentioned that because that's what Zoom's plan is. We're using Zoom. I was actually in their head office like 2 weeks ago, talking to Eric Yuan about this for a while. And they are like many other companies. I saw Uber announce this yesterday. A lot of companies are saying, look, we're going to have 2-3 days a week where everyone comes in on the same day. There are social days you work together. There's a lot of meetings, presentations, mentoring, training. And then the other 2 or 3 days, let's say Monday, Friday, Wednesday, everyone's going to go home. It's deep work. It's kind of quiet, reading, writing, maybe a one-on-one Zoom course. And why is this becoming dominant? I'll go through 4 reasons. The first, it makes employees happier. So you can ask people, how much do you value work from home as a % of pay? There's a lot of different ways to get to this. There's even randomized control trials. I'll summarize by saying people appear to value work from home 2-3 days a week is about the same as a 5 to 10% pay increase. They basically like it. It's definitely not everything, but it's an important positive amenity. No, people don't on average want to work from home every day. And that kind of matched what you saw, even what in the survey most people are doing. Most people in the US want to work from home on average 2 to 3 days a week. There's a big spread around that. So some certainly want to be fully remote. There are also some that want to come in every day. The important thing to note is the media kind of seems to imply that everyone wants to work from home all the time. That's not true. And that's particularly not true for younger people. So if you look at folks age 20 to 29, only a quarter of them want to be fully remote. The reason is younger folks tend to value more mentoring, which is best in person, value more socializing particularly, and their apartments where they live tends to be less, they're smaller, they have less space at home, and they'd rather go to the workforce. Second, findings on productivity. So again, there's quite a big literature. I'm going to summarize what it is. I mean, again, I'm happy to discuss it in more detail, but I'm not going to go through multiple papers. The pretty strong conclusion at this point is for what I'll call organized hybrid, whereby either team by team of the whole company, people come in on the same day. So for example, think of Zoom, they come in Tuesday, Thursday, or Salesforce, where they say, look, each team has to pick anchor days, but you've all got to come in on those days. That appears to boost productivity by something like 3 to 5%. And that boost has been rising over time as companies have got better at organizing this and managing this. Why is that? Well, the 2 big drivers of productivity are time and quiet. So on time, the average American seems to save about 70 minutes each day they work from home. About 60 minutes are saved by less commuting, and about 10 minutes are saved by less time getting ready. I won't horrify you with the details, but in our survey data, it's pretty clear people are less likely to wash, put on clean clothes, brush their teeth, shave, put on deodorant, etc. if they work from home. It saves a bit of time. Of that 70 minutes saved, about 30 minutes, so 40%, goes working on more on their primary job, and the other 40 minutes goes to leisure. So if you're an employer and you have people work from home 2 days a week, they on average probably work about 30 minutes more a day for you. So that's about an hour a week. If you think of 40-hour week, that's about 2.5% more time. So that's one clear gain. The other is there's a lot of evidence, again, some of this from randomized control trials, that quiet work, think reading, writing, data stuff, maybe one-on-ones, is actually better done at home because it's quieter at home. And so productivity per minute is also higher. Third angle is around diversity. So to be clear, every way you cut our data, or, I've shown Slack data on the right by gender, by age, by race, by actually religion, by political preference, etc. People on average want to work from home relatively similar amounts, but it's not identical. So in data, you tend to see minorities have a slightly higher preference to work from home than non-minorities. People with young kids, particularly women, have a slightly higher preference than those without. And the reason this is an important factor is if you're a firm and you're very hard-asked and you say, look, everyone's got to come back to the office 5 days a week, from this data, you can figure out who's the most likely to quit first. And that causes real diversity issues. And it means a lot of companies are, correctly inferring, look, if we want to promote diversity, if we force people back 5 days a week, that's going to make that substantially harder. Then finally, space. I'm not mentioned that much about that. Pre-pandemic, when I talk to companies about work from home, the big driver is saving space. It turns out now with hybrid, it's hard to do that. You can probably figure out pretty quickly if everyone's coming into the office, say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, working from home Monday, Friday, it's hard to cut space much at all. No one wants to sublet office space on a Monday and Friday. Of course, you can be clever and you can have scheduling like the way we schedule teaching rooms. So, Stanford, MIT, all of us have way more classes than rooms could hold at the same time. So you have to schedule, but that's hard. When you talk to companies, they say that's generally really hard to do it right now. Eventually, maybe we will, but right now we're just focusing on getting hybrid up and running. So there's not much office space saving currently. Couple of interesting facts. So one is work from home is dramatically higher in tech. This is it broken down by industry. The media tends to focus a lot on tech. I mean, in some ways rightfully, but tech is a bit of an outlier. So just to be clear, tech is really the only industry where you see large firms that are fully remote. In other industries, construction, government, retail, almost every company I talk to is typically hybrid for management. Startups are sometimes fully remote, but for larger companies, it's only really in tech you see big fully remote firms. The other is on geography, very relevant to transport. Work from home is hugely concentrated in bigger cities, in the most urban areas. This is population density. This is share of days from home, either by where you live or where you work. Turns out the results look very similar. It's very skewed towards big cities. About half of this is explained by the fact more educated folks in finance and tech work in big cities, but the other half seems to be something more fundamental about population density. So that's current where we are. In fact, so I talk about how firms are kind of norming on managing hybrid work from home, so that's challenging, and then long-run economics, and I'll stop. So the big challenge when I talk to companies is like how many days and which days. It's great to see Frank Levy on it. A lot of this is driven by what I call the task-based model of what we do in jobs. So the view is basically for companies, figure out what tasks, what activities are best done in person. Think meetings, presentations, mentoring, training events. What's best done remote. Think of quiet activities that require concentration, individual tasks. And then think, how many days a week do I need to do all those in-person tasks and try and push them into those days? So for a typical company, or for a professor, that might be 3 days a week. For all my teaching, research, seminars, bag lunches, that might take up 3 days. So I'm going to come in on those 3 days a week, and the other 2 days a week I work from home. One issue is over choice. So this is really difficult for companies to deal with. And the reason is last year in 2021, when people started to return to the offices with hybrid, or at end of 2020, there was a view you don't want people in on the same day, so you want them to socially distance. So a lot of companies were saying you should choose your days with the view that people are going to choose different days and they're going to space out a bit. The last 6 months have seen a real change in attitude, with now the view that, look, pretty much everyone is vaccinated. We're mostly returning, or if not, we're getting close to fully returning to a kind of pre-pandemic norm, and companies are now much more focused on productivity and efficiency. And that means they really want employees to come in on the same day. And this is one data graph that highlights why having folks come in on the same day makes sense. If you survey individuals and you say, what are the top 3 benefits of coming in to work on your employer's business premises? You can see 1 and 2 are face-to-face collaboration and socializing. So, Jim and I are working together with Frank, for example, or Nick, or John. We want to come in when we're in work. You want to see your colleagues, you want to be with them. For academics, maybe it seems obvious you want to be in seminars in the same day if you're in person and work from home on others. It turns out this is pretty much true across organizations. So what's happening in the US, increasingly so, it was fascinating seeing Uber this week that switched from letting employees choose to now saying, look, you're going to come in on 2 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday. We're going to have those lots of meetings, presentations, training. Monday, Wednesday, Friday is more quiet work. That turns out to be pretty common amongst large and particularly US firms. There's two versions. There's what's, Uber or Zoom, for example, which is you pick days for the whole firm. Or there's, for example, Salesforce and Google, whereby you let, or Blue Shield of California, or, there's a lot of companies in each box whereby you say each team, you pick your days, the whole team comes in, but teams can flex a bit. So it's not clear it matters a lot. It turns out that if you look at which days people want to work from home, which days they're actually working from home, it's mostly Monday, Friday. So in practice, the choice of days to come in is either 2 or 3 of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So, for transport, I was actually talking to someone earlier today from Network Rail in the UK who's saying they're seeing, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, very high commuting levels, Monday, Friday, dramatically lower. And that matches office occupancy date, matches which days people want to work from home. So, in terms of management, I would say for teams or organizations, coordinate on 2 or 3 days a week, make sure that there's a good reason for people coming in. So all the in-person and kind of social working is on those days in the office. Reading, writing data is on home days. And maybe for new hires, add an extra day in the office for mentoring. For people in their first year or so, it's very useful to have extra time in the office. So I'm going to end to talk a bit about impact on offices and real estate, which, very directly relates to transport. So I'll go through 4 of these. So first is, you might think that firms are going to dramatically cut office space. So one of the big surprises is we've gone from 5 to 30% of days working from home. That's a 25% reduction roughly in footfall into offices. In fact, offices have seen a bigger reduction because they're ground zero from work from home. So they've more gone from kind of 10 to 50. So offices have seen about a 40% reduction in footfall on any given day. And you can see that in many data sets like the Castle data is great at tracking that. So then you think, well, look, doesn't this mean folks are going to dramatically cut office space? The short answer is no, not much. Leases have shortened. There's a bit of a softening of space demand, but not massively. In the US, it's down 1%. UK, I have very good data there. It's down about 10%. UK's been hit by Brexit, so it's kind of a double whammy. Either way, that's way less than a reduction in footfall. And the reason is I hear from manager after manager, they're saying, it's really hard managing this hybrid thing. We were trying to just get people in on the same 3 days. No one wants to sublease space on Monday and Friday. In the long run, we're going to try and get more sophisticated. We're going to use software and polling and things to have overlapping schedules. But right now, we're just trying to take it, 1 month at a time. We're just trying to get people back in the office on the same days, and therefore we're leaving our office footprint the same. But people have moved. And I'm sure you see this very clearly in the commuting data. So what's happened is what I call the donut effect. A lot of individuals have said, you know what, if, think of someone living in the center of San Francisco and New York pre-pandemic, they were coming in the office 5 days a week in 2019. Now, if they're in tech or finance, they probably only go to come in 2, maybe 3 days a week. And a lot of them are saying, I want to live further out. I want more space. I want space for a home office, maybe a backyard. I can put up with a longer commute. And so you see a lot of evidence of folks moving out to the suburbs of big cities. So there's been a lot of movement. They're not leaving big city conurbations altogether. They're typically moving out from the centers out to the suburbs. And you can see very high population growth out in suburbs with negatives in city centers. But offices aren't moving, at least on the data I've seen. So again, it comes back to hybrid. Even if people are coming in 2 or 3 days a week, firms want them in on the same place at the same time. So this WeWork model of hub and spoke office hasn't really panned out. What's happened is most companies have just kept their offices, in city centers or on campuses, but people are just coming in less days. The big change to offices, though, not on location or size, is on internal design. So a lot of, what I'll call Mad Men, 1960s, 70s style long corridors or individual offices are being slowly phased out, particularly for mid or junior managers. And that space is being freed up into more meeting space, more open plan kind of loungy seating and Zoom cubicles. So, now people are in for 2-3 days a week. They're mostly in meetings, presentations, training events. They need much more meeting rooms. These things are really a premium. And if people do have to have a Zoom call, sound insulate them, get them away from shouting and disrupting everyone else, put them in a cubicle. Finally, something that I think is really interesting, it's a longer run trend, which is the big increase in offshoring and outsourcing. So to put this back at base, a lot of work from MIT, David Autor and co-authors have worked on this. There's been an enormous trade in manufacturing trade since 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. So manufacturing globalized heavily from 2000 to 2019. That looks like it's kind of taking a pause now. It's not reversing, but it's stopped growing. I think the next 20 years is really going to be about services, and work from home has made that far easier. So a lot of companies I've spoken to have said, we've discovered that this person or this team or this role has been great, fully remote. We're thinking, do they need to be in the company? Can we maybe outsource them? Can we move them across the US? Can we move them internationally? So I think looking ahead, this is going to affect travel and commuting in many ways, but I think we'll see a big increase in service sector trade. So I'll stop. I'm on Twitter. I try and put only data out on Twitter. And we have a website, Jinhua and I, some of our joint researchers on this. I'll stop now and go to a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. This is brilliant. Yeah. So Professor Frank Levy, please add some remarks and thoughts to that.
Let me unmute. I had really only one sort of general thought, and Nick's begun to answer it, I think. We've been working on a paper on political polarization and geographic patterns of political polarization. And as you know, at the beginning of the lockdown, there was a lot of talk about, well, if there's all this moving out of cities, maybe Idaho will turn blue because there are a lot of liberals moving, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. On the one hand, that clearly wasn't true once you started going into the moving numbers and so on. And on the other hand, what did seem to be true, and what I think Nick is describing in or at least potentially overlapping in the donut paper, is this process that a friend of mine here, a North Carolina political guy, calls countrypolitan districts. That in a metropolitan area like Charlotte-Mecklenburg, you sort of assume, or simple political analysis assumes, that if you're in the metropolitan area, all the votes must be Democratic. But in fact, that's not true, that there are these exurban areas toward the edge of the metropolitan area that are much wider than the metropolitan area as a whole, pretty well educated, pretty good income, strongly conservative in terms of their voting patterns. And the growth of this area seemed consistent with the idea of hybrid work. That is to say that you could, just as you said, just as Nick said on the setting of the donut paper, that kind of moving to that kind of area would be kind of impractical if you really had to go into work in the central city every day. But if you're only going in 3 days or 2 days a week, suddenly that thing opens up. Now, right now, what we just have is sort of these two things happening at the same time, and whether there's any kind of causal or any kind of political ramifications of this evolution of the metro area, or let me put it differently, whether hybrid work is helping the evolution of this metropolitan area, I don't know that, but I throw that out there as one possible thing to think about when you're talking about sort of how red-blue patterns develop in voting in the geographic area.
Frank, totally agreed. I think it's a fascinating topic. The other thing that's super interesting on political polarization is a bunch of the stuff on Genska and Shapiro and other data suggesting that people's least polarized source of information is from work. So it turns out our family and friends tend to hold very similar views to us. Yes, and we go online and we pick. So the only place, if you're a hardcore Trump fan, you come in contact with Democrats, and Bernie fan in reverse, is at work. And if people are working from home more days, you're maybe forced less to have, moderating conversations.
That's good. That's a good elaboration. I mean, I think there's some piece of work done to be sort of to pull that stuff together.
I totally, it's to flag this up, this is the pandemic, and the surge of work from home has impacted so many things. And in the research project, so just to say, all the microdata under everything I showed was share. I mean, we don't know people, we just poll 10,000 people a month, but we've been posting the data. There's so many research projects, Jinhua and I and his team have been working together and asking questions and stuff that people should definitely go to WFH Research and pull the data down. You're right, there's a lot of really interesting stuff. And the first stage is honestly just measuring it. But you're right, the impact is going to be massive for many years.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Nick. So I have a couple of questions to start the conversation, right? Again, I would encourage everybody in the audience to put questions in so John can curate them. So Nick, you mentioned that the impact is multifold, right? So maybe we'll follow the line of the impact on the cities, on the firms, on the employee, and a little bit on the transportation side. On the cities, right? As you mentioned that the bigger the city, the more likely people work from home, right? This makes the mayors of New York, Chicago, Boston all struggle. Every mayor saying, come back to downtown here. City needs you guys, right? So here I want to think about what type of things the city can do to actually enable or attract people back, right? But the other caveat to say that is, even though if you look at Boston, the financial district is much quieter. But if you look at the commercial district, like New Barry Street, they're booming. Actually, so it's not that people are abandoning cities. They just go to city for different reasons there, right? So what's your thought? What's your advice to the city planners, mayors who try to make the downtown booming again?
I mean, great question. I actually generally think it's positive if people move out from city centers a little bit. So to unwind, if you go back to 1980, city centers in the US were kind of scary, crime-ridden, low cost. I remember as a kid visiting New York. I went to Times Square with my parents in the early 80s. And during the middle of the day, we went into McDonald's on Times Square, and there were 2 security guards with open carry guns. And as a British kid, I was like astounded to see this, but I still remember it. It's like how dangerous was central New York in McDonald's during lunchtime, you know? So think since from the 80s to 2019, you saw city centers become denser and denser and more expensive. The pandemic has maybe unwound 10 years of that. So in some senses, the thing I think it's done is push back a bit on the affordability crisis. So city centers are relatively cheaper. They're not in absolute terms because house prices have gone up everywhere. You're right that Eric Adams, London Breed, folks like that, the people most concerned. In fact, I've worked a lot with Bay Area transport. A lot of these commute transports into city center are going to see permanent 30%, 20% reductions in ridership, and that's here to stay. And that is a real challenge. London Underground, the same. I think they need more fiscal support. And I think the problem is, take San Francisco. London Breed runs this core city center. A lot of people have moved out, her tax revenue's down, but then it's not that the money's disappeared. They're now out spending more money in the suburbs. So if we want this commute structure from suburbs into the city center, the suburbs have to contribute more of the funding for it. Of course, if they don't, they're going to slash, BART and everything else. Then there'll be Carmageddon as everyone starts driving. So in many ways, I've said this, but I was talking about something in New York. The trickiest issue is how to deal with transport. It's not obvious that we want to have cities as dense as they were in 2019. I think if, they're a little less dense and they go back to the way they were in 2005 or 2010, that's no bad thing. There'd be, office space would be a bit cheaper, a bit emptier. There'd be less city center retail, more suburban retail. But yeah, you're right. I think the fiscal, and particularly fiscal for transport infrastructure, is a challenge, and it needs basically redistribution, because suburbs have got more tax revenue and they need to hand some of that over to city centers, or at least to transport authorities.
Thank you. Yeah, in the audience, there are many city planners, public transit planners. We can continue the conversation on the impact on cities, right? So now let's move on to the impact on the firms. One thing you cite is the productivity measure has a moderate increase, 3 to 5% also, right? But assume that's by the definition is a short-term measurement of the productivity, right? So many people argue that in the short term, if you quantify the productivity by number of hours, you measure that. But if you look at the long-term impact, the part of the spontaneity that we described, the company culture, the creativity that bring people together, those things may not show up in 2 years time span there. So what's your thought on how do you even think about to understand the long-term impact of this productivity?
I totally agree. So there are 3 modes: there's fully in person, hybrid, and fully remote. And I think fully remote is really quite problematic for this reason. Now, it's not to say it's dominated. So I've talked to several CEOs of big tech firms that are fully remote, and they say, look, the 2 big upsides of fully remote: you don't have to pay for space costs, and you can hire people globally. You have a much better labor supply. But they're aware that the downsides, it is harder to be creative and it's harder to mentor and train people. So there are some major trade-offs. On hybrid, I think organized hybrid, coming back to, Frank's task-based model, can mostly get it right. So think as academics. Seminars are better in person. There's more feedback, and that we go in, we have research meetings, we have teachings better in person, but I don't need to be in 5 days a week. So if it's well organized, what happens is the creative stuff that's in meetings, that's face to face, we just crush into 3 or 2 very social days. At the end of that, you're like, oh, I never, I've had enough. I'm like spent 10 hours talking to people on a break. But then the upside is the 2 days at home, you get quiet work. And in fact, a lot of the evidence is you're most innovative if you have some time to quietly think and sometimes with others. So I don't think if it's well organized, it's problematic. I do think if hybrid's chaotic and different people are coming in on different days, or it's fully remote, it's more problematic. I mean, as an indication on that, we did a big randomized control trial with trip.com, which is one of the big 3 travel agents. We took 1,600 coders, software. They're all grads. A third of them are postgrads, like computer scientists. And they randomized by even and odd birthdays, whether they work from home for 2 days a week or not. And they actually found the folks working from home 2 days a week wrote 8% more lines of code. Now, that's not a perfect metric, but it's one metric. It's the hardest data we have, and these are checked and entered into software the firm is using. So, this is not like rubbishly writing extra code, it's just padding. This is stuff that went into product. So I think if it's well organized, hybrid is actually a win-win. The challenge is over being well organized. And fully remote, yes, definitely has that trade-off. There's a nice paper in Nature, by the way, that recently came out on exactly that. It is harder to innovate when you're remote.
Thank you. Yeah. So the third one is on the employee side, right? So in the survey that you conducted, there is clear tension between the employee preference versus the employer plan here, right? Typically, for a long time, we observed that employee generally wants one more day of work at home, right? While employee wants to say, no, come back to work with me here, right? So how do you see this tension is evolving over time, and how do you observe the corporations actually settle on that tension, right? How they are making such a decision, and also is it in terms of the negotiation power when the labor market is tight, the employee seems to have a more power in the negotiation. While if the economic turn is turning, that power structure may evolve, right? How do you see that happen?
Great. So you're right. Very early on in the pandemic, so go back to like May 2020, there's an enormous gap between what employers were offering and what employees wanted. So employees wanted like 2.5 days a week at home. Employers were offering about 1. Over the next 2 years, this was, a 5-0 win to employees. So employers just became more and more generous. You have this question. We asked people post-pandemic, what has your employer told you you're going to do? And the number of days work from home has just gone up and up and up and up and up. And what's happened over the last 2 years is employers have said, you know what, this works pretty well. We're going to settle on hybrid, 2-3 or 3-2. So at this point now, for grads, for the half of the population that can work from home, so everyone listening, actually what employees want roughly aligns with what employers are offering. It's kind of, the averages are about 2.5 on each side. The gap is for non-grads. So the other 50% of people who can't work from home, they still want to work from home. If you ask them, they'd still like to work from home 1 or 2 days a week. They're getting offered close to 0. So in this kind of binary situation now where everyone listening probably is roughly getting what they want. And I mean, I know there are some people that want more and less, but as a population, the means of this is roughly aligning with what firms are offering. It's the other half that aren't getting it. In terms of the recession, I don't think it'll have a big effect. It will have some, not massive. The reason is you go through the 4 reasons that people are going for hybrid. It keeps employees happy, improves productivity, it supports diversity, saves maybe on space. They're all pretty acyclical. So I don't, it's 30% now. It may go back to 25%. My view is more like long run is a Nike swoosh. So it may drop to 25%, but technology is getting a lot better. And that's really going to be the long run driver. So what we're using now on Zoom is pretty good. But, this is way better than what we had 10 years ago, the cloud. If you look forward, because of the size of work from home has gone up so much, the amount of R&D poured into it has gone up a lot. So hardware and software is going to accelerate. So 5-10 years from now, levels are going to be a lot higher than they are now. That's a pretty safe bet, actually. Just, yesterday I spent, an example, yesterday I spoke to this company called Neat. I don't know if everyone's using one of their devices. They said in 2020, they make devices for video calls. They said in 2020, they had 8 people. Before the pandemic, they now have 250. You can imagine how much more R&D they're spending on this stuff. And Zoom is the same. They've expanded. So the technical progress to support work from home is picked up a lot, which means if I was a transport planner looking 5-10 years out, it's a very safe bet that 10 years from now, levels will be higher than they are now.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I think maybe the last question from me, and then give it to John for that, is that you've been studying this for many, many years, right? Long way before the COVID. So during the 2 years, which part of the organization that surprised you? versus which part of that surprised many other people but didn't surprise you? Is that's the natural trend that you have been observing all along. So can you differentiate some of that?
I mean, the thing that surprised me that maybe it shouldn't have done, but it did, was it just works so well. I mean, look, pre-pandemic, I don't know if you remember that phrase, shirking from home, working from home, and working remotely working. It was, so people were so skeptical. They said, you know, it's like, there's that joke, the three enemies of working from home are the bed, the fridge, and the television. And, you know, it's nobody does, they're goofing off, etc. 2 years in, that view has totally changed. So now people think you can be efficient, CEOs, execs, you know, go-getters are all working from home, not full-time mostly, but they're certainly working from Mondays, Fridays. The world has just completely shifted, and attitudes and everything with it. So that strikes me as the biggest. So, I mean, the other thing that's amazing is why we didn't do this earlier. I don't think we could have, you know, when I first started working from home in the early 2000s, like 2002 or 3, it was telephone calls and like emailing files. It's pretty horrible. I mean, you know, both my parents worked, and I'm one of 4 kids. They used to work from home when I was a kid for childcare reasons, you know, on every occasional days. And they said it was horrible. It was like pieces of paper, and that you didn't use a computer because you didn't have personal computers at home. So the technology's got a lot better, but certainly 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, we had cloud and Dropbox, and we had Zoom and Teams, or Zoom for sure. We could have done this. So that's the other thing. Maybe there are other massive changes out there that no one's thought about. But yeah, the biggest surprise is how well this has worked. And, you know, that's linked to why it's now just sticking.
Indeed, yeah. Just follow up on the point that why didn't we do this early, right? I was thinking, imagine before COVID, MIT tried to set up all sort of committees, or let's make a decision on let's work from home for some time. My bet it will never reach any decision on this, right? COVID really forced it into this, right? But the question is how much after we gradually coming out of COVID, how much we preserve and how much we revert. That's, I think, one thing here more. But John, I'll pass to you to organize the audience question answers.
On that, what's really interesting, if you look across countries or across counties in the US and you regress levels of work from home now on the length of the lockdown, it's highly significant and positive. So it seems that parts of the US that had long lockdowns, or countries that forced people to work from home for longer, now have permanently higher levels, and you can control for education and income and industry. It doesn't go away. So a lot of it seems to be and that's why Australia and New Zealand have low levels. They're never really forced into it and never really stuck. So, I mean, the pandemic's been horrible, but oddly, the 2 years of forcing people, a year and a half, to work remotely seems to have permanently shifted the equilibrium.
Indeed. Yeah, John?
Nick, we have a hugely active chat, so lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to try my best here to curate this. There's a lot of questions around sort of this optimal hybrid concept that you talked about, where there's components of work that lend themselves better to remote, and there's components of work that lend themselves better to on-site. And I'm wondering, just in general, you know, do you have any sort of data or research that looks by job category, like where that optimal mix might be? So, for example, you know, if you work at a restaurant, if you work at a bank, is there some way to sort of strike that balance, that optimal?
Great. I mean, again, you know, it's interesting going back to the Frank's Auto-Levi-Murnane paper. And a more recent so they looked at something called the Dictionary of Occupational Terminology. I'm make sure I get the name right. They're basically, there's an enormous database of what each job, what the activities they tend to do. More recently, Jonathan Dingle and Brent Neiman updated this in terms of research, and they look at each job and try and figure out what activities are in person, what need to be in person, and what can be done remotely. So take, you know, janitor, cleaning floors, wiping windows, cleaning bathrooms. That's pretty clearly they classify has to be in person, or Chipotle serving burritos, etc. Whereas for us, it's, you know, writing papers can be done remotely. They have a score, occupation by occupation, that turns out to predict extremely accurately how many days and what share of people work from home. So I think it entirely comes down to activity. And there are some activities for us, like teaching is much better in person. And I think research, this works. I mean, this, as you say, this setup today is really great. You guys have fine-tuned, you know, the mix of discussion, presentation. But, you know, often people find it easier, particularly for grad students when they're presenting, to be in person. But there are other things. I think if I'm oddly enough, meeting one-on-one with somebody, I prefer to do it on Zoom because we can share screens more easily. So if you look across, I showed you data by industry, that maps really tightly to the Engel and Neal past measures. So if you look at IT, the reason it's such high levels is most of the stuff is kind of slightly more individualistic coding, or you can work jointly by sharing a screen.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it's easy to quantify the example of software, right? Where you can actually quantify lines of code. It's far more difficult to quantify the sense of camaraderie or purpose that, when a group of people come together as a team to accomplish something, we all recognize that's a hugely important part of our work for many occupations. Difficult to quantify that from a research perspective. So
no, you're right, John. And as an observation on that, if you look at firms that are fully remote, so like 3 companies I've spoken to a bunch, Upwork, Automatic, and Quora, they've gone fully remote. They still have teams meet up once a month or once every a month for like a week. So, the Europeans will all go to Barcelona, the Americans maybe Albuquerque, wherever it is, because exactly that. They're like, even though we're fully remote, we still need to meet face-to-face every other month to build bonds.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, look, lots of forward-looking questions. So we had a question from Michael Long about how much of the current working from home stickiness do you attribute to this current tight labor market? And, with so many folks speculating we may be heading into a recession, how do you think about the evolution of that curve that you started with going forward?
Great question. Oddly enough, I think it's a classic example of hysteresis, which is, things push in one direction and they stick. So it has been a big fact, having tracked this very closely. Early in the pandemic, firms are saying, don't get comfortable with working from home. You're coming back, you're coming back in the office. And the first break was Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg in May 2020 that said, this is pretty good. We may have a day or two post-pandemic remote. And what's happened is the combination of A, the lockdowns, and B, the tight labor market have actually meant that firms have left it for far longer. And the tight labor markets, because it's just so many companies I've spoken to have said, unless we offer remote 2-3 days a week, we just can't get anyone. We got to pay them 10-20% more. Now, it's a great question is, that obviously the social distancing is kind of going off now. The tight labor market, you saw the numbers today, we're not quite off now, but it's certainly softening. I don't think it's going to lead to a massive unwinding because A, we know what we know, and you can't unknow that work from home works pretty well. And B, there's kind of an equilibrium shift with a lot of investment in technology, organizational capital, etc. So we may go from 30 to 25, but I don't think we're ever going to unwind much below that. Yeah. My prediction is we'll go to 25 maybe by the end of next year. Then we'll be up to 30 2 years from now, and 5 years, 10 years will be 35, 40 because of technology. It's just going to make it easier and easier.
Fascinating. So really, it's just this COVID really just fundamentally changed us. It changed the nature of work. It changed our concept of work. And as you point out, the technology is always getting better. So just helping to facilitate remote working. We had a question from Frank Duma about there's a lot of interest in the chart that you showed around bigger cities tending to have higher levels of remote. So is higher incidence of work from home in larger cities also related to commute time? I know you touched on this a little bit in the conversation with Genoa and the conversation about the implications for transport, but because we have such a transport intensive crowd, any further reflections on that correlation between larger cities and what the implications could be for commuting and for transportation?
It's a great question. I tell you the facts that we know. And in fact, there's a parallel study, and I can't remember who's involved in it, but Gilles Duranton, I think, has been doing some stuff from Wharton using LinkedIn data. We both find basically a similar stylized fact, which is there's a very steep slope between density and work from home levels. You then say, well, why is that? And in regressions, you can control for education, because, more educated people in cities, industry, I think some age and some other, everything we can see, and we halve that slope. So the question is, what's the rest? And then maybe the rest is just those controls aren't very good. So, all we know is you've got a degree or not. We don't know the quality of a degree. And it may be MIT and Stanford people in city centers and, less good degree institutions out in the suburbs, or it could be there's something else. And I think you're right. Commute times are definitely higher in city centers. So I suspect that is part of the something else. I honestly don't know. We have the micro data on the website, so others are more than happy to take a crack at it. It's not something we've focused on too much. The people that are in city centers is a huge driver of it. I suspect commute is part of it. I think there's probably other things too. And I saw it more as there was this view. I mean, I think Frank mentioned it earlier, that people do move out to the countryside early on and all work from home. We just don't really see that. I mean, you may think, I showed you by where they live and where they work. In either places, people in rural areas have very low levels of work from home. And that's kind of surprising maybe, but I mean, it is what it is, and it hasn't shifted. So it's not like we're 2 years into the pandemic and we're still seeing that. So that strikes me almost as a missed opportunity, if anything.
Jinhua, did you have anything just to add from the transport perspective?
Right. No, I mean, it's more of the question therefore about controlling what we can control, half the slope, right? I think in the commuting time, we can empirically incorporate that, right? We can test those things, right? The other thing is, look at the beginning of the pandemic, the people just scared about the disease, right? The sheer density, people are more sensitive to that in many ways on that. That's a public health concern at the beginning. But I think that concern should be gradually diminishing to quite a degree. Yeah, I don't know if we can quantify that or not, but that could also be one factor that influencing this halving of the slope. How much can we push down to that, right?
So Mackenzie Human had a question, which is, I think, very interesting, also looking forward, and I think a little bit getting into the concept of induced demand. And the question was, do you think the average time savings, which Nick, you pointed out was 60 minutes from commuting for hybrid work from home, will remain or be crowded out as home location choices adjust to hybrid work options? In other words, people may move further away from work because they don't have to commute every day. Then their commutes may be longer on the days that they go in. So it's almost like, it seemed there is this concept of like a kind of a transport budget, so people are willing to spend a certain amount of time per day, per week in their commute. Maybe with this donut pattern, we just see a redistribution of that transport budget. What are your thoughts on that?
No, exactly right. So do you think exactly? So we think of it as an elasticity. So, how elastic you are and the hours of commute per minute. And in fact, this is a huge issue for the environmental impact. So early on, everyone was very excited and said, wow, this is going to be incredible. There's less commuting, therefore there'll be less pollution. But you're completely right that now people are commuting less, but A, they're commuting further. B, they're living out in the suburbs, which are less energy efficient housing versus city centers. And C, a lot of places now, firms are heating or air conditioning the office Monday to Friday, but it's half empty, but the employees are also at home, heating or air conditioning their houses. So I think these kind of questions are hugely important and have a big impact on commute, but also environmental effects of work from home.
Right, on that, just to add that the commuting trip reduced, but the total amount of traffic fully recovered. If particularly the car side fully recovered, which not recovered yet is the public transit.
Right. Okay, another question coming in, and again, I think we alluded to this a little bit, but another question from Frank Duma. Any thoughts as to how cities might change their land use regulations to be more attractive to these trends? And I think we could maybe debate what that word attractive means, but maybe anticipatory of these trends. What should cities be doing? How should cities be thinking about some of the data trends that you pointed out?
Again, a really important question. I think the key observation is in city centers particularly, there's a reduction, there's certainly already a reduction in demand for retail space. So a lot less people are shopping because, it's office workers buying food and drink at lunch or shopping, and they're just not coming in as much. There's less demand for office space, particularly lower grade office space. And housing is so expensive. So an ideal situation, you convert retail and office to residential. The tricky thing, having talked to quite a lot of investors, is that's not easy to do. So if you think of a typical office layout, it doesn't have nearly enough bathrooms. If you have to break an office down into like 20 apartments, there's only typically 2 bathrooms, and the elevators and windows, like offices have huge, but certainly that's the kind of direction we want to go. And coming back to filling up city centers, you're just take San Francisco, you're just not going to have the number of tech workers going in every day as we had pre-pandemic. I mean, that's like a fact, you know, not living up to that is just ignoring reality. And the same, those tech workers are not spending and shopping on Starbucks and Au Bon Pans and as much as before. So you've now got a lot of empty space. You're much better off converting that into residential so that you can have people use that space and live in city centers. So I think that's the big challenge. And as much, I'm not sure how much is land use versus actually just these buildings, you know, big square footage office buildings are not that easy to convert to residential property. It will happen slowly, but it's hard because of light, toilets, amenities, other things like that.
Great. I think I saw Sichi online as well, and I don't mean to catch you off guard, Sichi, but if you're still on with us, do you have any reactions on the real estate side?
I think he probably have left. Let me check.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, I think we have just one last question here. So we have a question from Thea Jansen. Do you have any evidence on the Great Resignation leading more firms to hire more fully remote workers residing in another city or location?
So yes, certainly hiring. So by the way, I just tweeted out the slides. So anyone is interested, not tweeted, I put in chat, just put a link to the slides if anyone wants to copy them. On yes, hiring across locations is definitely going to go up. We should look in our data actually. I just know anecdotally a lot of companies are hiring. You mean seen 15% of people are fully remote. We know from the American Community Survey pre-pandemic that was 2%. So that group has gone up even faster than, you know, it's the biggest growth group. And take Stanford, MIT I'm sure is doing the same. We now have a policy that you no longer have to live in California to be a fully remote worker. At Stanford, you can live anywhere in the US. We won't allow people to live abroad. Whether that will eventually change, I don't know. But we apparently have a lot of employees across the country in the way we didn't do previously. So I think a lot of, you know, HR, payroll, you know, call centers are going to be moving out to lower cost of living areas. And I think that's good. I mean, I think that's pretty much all good, actually. It reduced the cost of living in the Bay Area and in Boston and pushed jobs into parts of the country where it's, you know, there's relatively less employment opportunity.
Great. Thanks. So Nick, this is brilliant. So everybody, please join me. Thank Professor Blum for the presentation and the conversations. This is really great.
Thank you very much for, you know, following this far, and thank you for, Jinran. I was going to say the stuff that we've been working on the third place is really interesting. So Jinran, you know, was early on his team, spotted early on that it's not just home or office as a third place. And early in the pandemic, there wasn't much of that because people basically were, you know, sheltering in place. But increasingly, there's a lot of third place activity, and a lot of it's like going out somewhere nearby, but it's not home and not your office. I think it's really interesting to see how that evolves.
Great. Yeah, I'll shout out to Nick Karros and Xiaotong Guo, the 2 students working on this as well. Nick, thank you again. And see everybody next week. Nick, can you stay for 1 minute? I will create a breakout room, just some of the questions I'll ask you quickly on that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I just opened the room here.